As we read Blue, and as we discuss racial injustices this week, there's some vocabulary that you will need to know to participate in our discussions. This video will provide a brief overview of that vocabulary. If you have questions, don't worry. We're going to be discussing this more throughout the week. The first vocabulary word is race. Race are groups that humans are often divided into based on physical traits regarded as common among people of shared ancestry. Examples of race might include white or Caucasian, Black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander. Ethnicity. Large groups of people grouped by common racial, national, tribal, religious, linguistic, or cultural background. Examples of ethnicity might be Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx. It's just another way of dividing people into groups. Minority racial group. A racial group with a smaller population compared to other racial groups within a region. For example, in the United States of America, there are fewer Black people than white people, so Blacks are a minority racial group in the United States of America. Coloreds. Derogatory ethnic descriptor for African Americans. This is a term that is no longer used but was used during the time of the book, so you might see this word in the book Blue. However, it's an insulting term, and it's not a term that we'll be using in class. Injustice, unfairness, or a violation of one's rights. Racial injustice, acts of unfairness towards a minority racial group. Stereotype, a common mental picture that is held by members of a group that represents an oversimplified opinion, prejudice attitude, or uncritical judgment. Now, there are positive stereotypes and negative stereotypes, but all kinds of stereotypes are bad, and I'll explain why in a minute. Some examples of positive stereotypes are that women are caring, Black Americans are athletic, or Asian Americans are good at math. Some negative stereotypes include that women are bad drivers, Black Americans are violent, or Asian Americans are unfriendly. Pause for a moment and think about why positive stereotypes might also be bad. So we can see why negative stereotypes are not kind towards people that they're describing, right? But neither are positive stereotypes. For example, let's look at that positive stereotype that Asian Americans are good at math. Imagine if there is an Asian American in your class that everyone expected to be good at math, but that student really struggled with math. If they don't live up to that expectation or that stereotype, that might cause them to get made fun of or to feel bad about themselves. So positive stereotypes are equally as bad as negative stereotypes. Bias. Unconscious judgments about groups of people based on stereotypes. Example. Because Sally believes the stereotype that Black men are violent, she crossed to the other side of the street to get away from a Black man that she saw when walking home from work. You can see why stereotypes are negative because they make people act on beliefs that are not necessarily true. Discrimination. The unfair treatment of a minority group of people based on stereotypes about that group. Example. Because Billy believes a stereotype that Asian Americans are unfriendly, he does not try to become friends with the new student who is Asian American at school. Prejudice. An irrational attitude of hostility towards a minority group of people. For example, because Joe believes stereotypes about Black people, he yells cruel phrases at a Black family taking a walk by his house. So while discrimination is a belief system about a minority group of people that causes you to act a certain way towards that group of people, Prejudice is also an attitude, but it's an attitude of hostility. So that means that you're actively mean or actively take action against a minority group of people. Segregation, the forced separation of racial groups as a result of discrimination towards a minority racial group. Example, white school versus black schools. During the time of the book, white people and black people couldn't go to school together. They couldn't go in the same restaurants together. They couldn't go in movie theaters together. They were required by law to be segregated. Jim Crow laws, laws in the South that forced blacks to be segregated from whites. Separate but equal, a legal phrase used during the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case to justify racial segregation in the South. So this is a legal term that was used by people at the time to justify there being racial segregation in the South. They said it's okay to be separate because we're all equal. Well, we know that wasn't necessarily the case. For example, look at this picture. There is a water fountain for white people and a water fountain for colored people. You can see the descriptor above the water fountain. Does it look like these two water fountains are equal? No, absolutely not. The white water fountain is a lot nicer than the colored water fountain. And this was pretty consistent throughout other areas of life as well. Oftentimes, the resources that Black Americans had access to were not equivalent or not as good as the resources that white people had access to. So this terminology is incorrect. People were separate, but they were not equal. Integration, the mixing of racial groups. During this time, some people were fighting for integration, like we see in the book when the letter is written so that Black polio patients and white polio patients can be mixed in the hospital. People were fighting for this so that people could have the same access to resources that they needed. Oppression, unjust or cruel exercise of power against a minority group. For example, like we read in the book, Black polio patients were not able to be admitted to all hospitals to get the treatment they needed. Systemic oppression, unequal treatment of a group of people created by laws. An example of this are the Jim Crow laws that we were just talking about. The picture on the right is a political cartoon that talks about how people were separate, but they were not equal. Again, you can see how the white water fountain is much nicer than the black water fountain. We'll talk more about this vocabulary throughout the week, and if you have questions, feel free to ask Ms. Sparks or Ms. True in class.